Saleemul Huq, we're interested in the question of what Bangladesh might look like by 2030, say, if there were no climate change, and what changes we have to make if there is climate change.
Let me look back a generation since Bangladesh became independent in 1971. I think over that period there have been several major achievements in Bangladesh. The population growth rate has come down very considerably, from something in the region of 3% a year to less than 2% a year, in a predominantly Muslim country without coercion. And that's a major breakthrough. Getting the Muslim imams on board on family planning, providing mother and child care to the population. At the same time, we've also improved education of the populace in general, particularly girls' education, and now women going into the workforce, for example, in the textile and garment industry.
Well, now here we have Bangladesh, a successful country. If we project all that to 2030, I imagine you would say Bangladesh is likely to be much more industrialized, much larger service sector. 2% growth a year still gives us quite a big increase in the population by 2030. Does Bangladesh find its place in the world in that region where you have your Thailands and your Malaysias and, of course, India growing so fast and China on the other side? Where's Bangladesh's niche going to be?
Well, Bangladesh sees itself in the next 20 years becoming a middle-income country, maybe in the order of between Thailand and Malaysia. It has the ability to do so. We have a very thriving private sector and very capable entrepreneurs who've established themselves in certain sectors, in the garments and textiles in particular. They can upgrade to higher technologies. Very thriving mobile phone sector, for example, in Bangladesh, and a very thriving social and entrepreneurial sector. In fact, we have, by some accounts, the biggest NGO in the world, BRAC, which is now an international NGO working in Afghanistan and in many countries in Africa.
And, of course, Muhammad Yunus, Nobel Prize winner.
And we have Nobel Prize, Muhammad Yunus on the Grameen Bank and microfinance as well.
Now, if we take that picture, which is an optimistic picture for Bangladesh, how does climate change threaten the trajectory?
Climate change threatens the trajectory quite significantly. I mean, Bangladesh in the climate change world has become the iconic vulnerable country. We have floods, which are going to get worse. We have cyclones, which are going to get more frequent or more intense. We have droughts in part of the country during part of the year as well. So most of the climatic impacts, other than very dry conditions, are going to affect the country, and it'll affect agriculture, it'll affect livelihoods of people. But these are not unknowns. These are things that we, as I've mentioned, we have coped with in the past. They'll just get worse. So we need to be much, much better prepared than we used to be. A few years ago, when we had a major flood in Bangladesh, I happened to be in the country, and the Permanent Secretary in the Prime Minister's office, who was organizing the relief effort, invited me to a meeting, and he asked me, he said, is this what we should expect with climate change? What should we do? And I said, well, yes, this is the kind of thing you should expect, and what you need to do is expect it every year. Don't wait for the next 20 years for the next 1 in 20-year flood. Assume it might happen next year. Prepare yourself.
Tell us a bit about how Bangladesh is addressing that challenge of managing the planning and the politics of climate change.
Well, I'll give you my personal take on it, which I think is evolving from having the climate change issue be parked in the ghetto of environment. It was seen as an environment problem, and the economic pressing issues of development and growth were seen as much more important, and environment was a luxury we couldn't afford or we worry about later on. That, I think, has changed dramatically now. Even the highest political levels in the government and in political parties more generally.
And is that a cross-party issue, or is it part of the political conversation in Bangladesh?
Absolutely a cross-party issue. I'll give you one example. The Bangladesh Climate Change Strategy and Action Plan that I mentioned was prepared about 1.5 years ago by the previous government. And it was prepared by Bangladeshi national researchers, experts, and government people with consultation from civil society. And it was presented to the cabinet about 1.5 years ago. And the finance minister at the time was so taken with this, he said, why are we waiting for international assistance to do this? We should do it ourselves. And he allocated $50 million worth of Bangladeshi currency in his own national budget to implement a climate change strategy and action plan. And then that started rolling out. And then we had elections, and a new government came in. The new finance minister added another $50 million to the climate change strategy. They adopted it, lock, stock, and barrel, and Bangladesh has now put $100 million of its own money into implementing its climate change strategy. At the same time, it's asking for international assistance as well, but it's not waiting for that to happen.
How necessary is it for Bangladesh that there be an international climate accord to replace Kyoto, and how necessary is it to have the level of international funding, the $100 billion a year that's being talked about, to support the poor and vulnerable countries?
Well, on the first point, I think it's absolutely essential. There is only so much that the poor and vulnerable countries can do to adapt to the major impacts of higher temperatures, global temperatures. Maybe a degree, 1.5 degrees, up to possibly 2 degrees, they could do it themselves. But if it goes to 3.5, 4 degrees, which is where we are now projected to go, then they're not going to be able to manage at all. And not only them, the entire globe is going to be in very, very big trouble. And that can only be solved by a global agreement to bring down emissions by the major emitters of the world. At the more mundane level of how they can cope with themselves, as I said, they're putting 100 million in themselves. Their own cost estimate is in the region of 3 to 5 billion. So they're very far short of reaching that. They have set up something called the Climate Change Resilience Fund, where they've invited international donors to provide assistance. The UK has put in money, Denmark, Japan, and a few other countries. They've already raised over 100 million in that trust fund as well. So in a sense, there's a good example of a country, A, being proactive, and B, the donors and the supporters also being proactive in terms of not competing with each other, but working together to help the country.
Saleemul Huq, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.